we're going to be talking about the high resolution feature that you can find in the settings button right here, and by going to high resolution. You'll see a bunch of settings here, so what does this do exactly? Rendering at high resolutions is extremely demanding on your graphics cards. So in the previous examples, we've been rendering at 1920 by 1080p, which is just an HD resolution, and that's usually fine. But if you want to crank up those resolutions even higher, not everyone has the luxury of having a high-end graphics card, especially in this day and age. Most Unreal users are using consumer level cards. Once you start cranking up this resolution here to 4K, 8K, 16K, there is a very high likelihood that your renders are going to crash. You're going to have a bad time. But that is where the high resolution tool comes in to save the day. What this is going to do is it's going to split your render into 4 tiles. So imagine you have your frame right here. Imagine this is a resolution of 4K. Rendering in 4K can crash a render depending on your scene. It is very VRAM heavy. So what the high resolution tab is going to do is it's going to split your render into tiles like this. So instead of rendering a single massive 4K image, it's going to render 4 times HD instead. So 4 renders of 1920 by 1080 is a lot easier to manage on your graphics card than a single 4K image. That is what the high resolution tile feature does. So by adding the high resolution setting, you'll be presented with a few new features. So I'm going to go to output and set this to a resolution of 4K, which is 3840 by 2160. Next, I'm going to go to the high resolution tab and set the tile count to 2. And you'll see right here, it says at the bottom, this will render 4 tiles, each with an individual resolution of 1920 by 1080. Now, before we start rendering, it's important to understand some of the caveats and downsides of the high resolution feature. As of now, it does not support some rendering features that rely on screen space effects. That includes screen space reflections, bloom, lens flares, and motion blur on very fast moving objects. It also doesn't support temporal anti-aliasing or auto exposure. So in order to fix that, we need to go into our post-process volume in the World Outliner, and we're going to search for exposure, and we need to set the auto exposure to manual right here, because what's going to happen otherwise is this. Your image is going to be very dark, because like I said, high resolution does not support auto exposure. Your frame may get too dark or way too bright, but don't worry, that's okay. We can fix that by clicking on exposure compensation and adjusting the slider accordingly, if you want it brighter or darker like that. I'm going to leave it like this, and now going back to our movie render queue settings, we're going to have to go add the anti-aliasing tab again, and make sure that anti-aliasing is set to none. For the moment, we don't need to set temporal or spatial sample counts. Once you've done all this, we can hit the accept button, and hit render local. Now you'll see the render is much slower, but that's entirely normal. Now there's one more thing that we need to do in our post-process volume first, and that's disabling bloom. So I intentionally rendered it this way because I want to show you the effect of not disabling screen space effects. And it's this. We get this really nasty line where the bloom gets cut off. And also you might notice along the lines here, it doesn't look very, we get this nasty seam along here as well, as we can see. So there are 2 things we need to do to fix that and get a better looking image. The first of which is going into the post-process volume again and disabling bloom. So in the details panel, we can search for bloom and set the bloom intensity to 0. And secondly, to get rid of the nasty line that we saw in the middle of our frame is by going back into the movie render queue settings, click on settings. In high resolution, we can set the overlap ratio to 0.1. 0.1 is usually a good starting point. Depending on your result, you can crank that value up a little bit higher if you still have seams. Just keep in mind that will affect your render times and it can take substantially longer. So keep it low for now. Once you've done all of that, once you've disabled your screen space effects like bloom, and we set our overlap ratio to 0.1, we can hit the accept button and render local one more time. And now, if you've done everything correctly, we no longer have our big ugly bloom line across the middle here. Earlier we had this big nasty seam in the middle here. We no longer have that thanks to the overlap ratio. Now you might notice your render is pretty noisy, lots of artifacts and fireflies and such. The solution to this is to increase your spatial or temporal samples. The only reason I didn't set them earlier was to show you the effects of not using temporal and spatial samples when you disable anti-aliasing. So it's very important that if you set the anti-aliasing to none, try cranking up your spatial or temporal sample counts to get less noise in your render. This is what it will look like if you increase your temporal or spatial samples. You'll see we don't have any more noise in our image. So if you turn off anti-aliasing, be sure to add some temporal or spatial samples to denoise your image a little bit. So to conclude, the high resolution feature is very useful and can really get you out of a bind, especially if you absolutely need higher resolutions in production, but it is important to be aware of its drawbacks.